Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us to celebrate the launch of Yassmin Abdel-Magied's new book, Talking About a Revolution, for which she's in conversation tonight with Beejay Silcox. Before we commence, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands from which people are zooming in on tonight and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. The best way to view this session is in speaker view, which will shift the focus between Yassmin and Beejay as they talk. You'll find that menu option in the top right corner of your Zoom screen. The Zoom audience has been muted to help avoid any technical interruptions in the conversation between Yassmin and Beejay, but the audience can ask questions using the Zoom chat box. We'll refer to those questions at the end of the conversation. I'll be posting a link to Yassmin's book in the chat box, should you wish to purchase it online. If you'd like to tweet about the event and include Avid, we're at avidreader4101. Yassmin Abdel-Magied, it's time to introduce the person of the hour. She's a writer, recovering engineer, award-winning social advocate. She writes on politics, technology, and culture. Yassmin strives to analyse society's systemic challenges, reframe established narratives, and make complex ideas accessible to all. Yassmin has published 4 books and is developing a number of projects to screen. In a previous life, she founded Youth Without Borders at the annoyingly tender age of 16, leading it for 9 years before co-founding 2 other organisations focused on serving women of colour. Yassmin is currently a trustee of the London Library and stakeholder committee chair with the Black Writers Guild. In all her work, Yassmin is an advocate for transformative justice and a fairer, safer world for all. She's Beejay Silcox, who's a writer, literary critic, and cultural commentator. Her reviews regularly appear in national arts publications and are increasingly finding an international audience. Beejay came to writing circuitously. She's worked as an agony aunt, a criminologist, a strategic policy boffin, a corporate ghostwriter, and an accidental economist. It's better for everyone involved that she now reads for a living. Beejay has stories to tell. She drove to Timbuktu in a car held together by a bar strap and eloped to Las Vegas. Beejay recently relocated to Canberra from Cairo via a pandemic year in her parents' ever-obliging shed. I've shortly hand over the conversation to the owners of those formidable bios, and I'll mute my camera and microphone, but I'll be monitoring the chat box. I'll rise again around 7:15 p.m. to wrangle any audience questions we may have. In the meantime, just for those who are coming in late, I'm just still admitting a few more people. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands from which people are zooming in on tonight and pay my respects, elders past, present, and emerging. And I'd now like to hand over to Beejay and Yassmin.
Good evening, everyone. It's so lovely to be able to join you tonight for this conversation. I first met Yassmin on a blind date. It's hard to make friends in your 30s, and a mutual friend set us up, who is in fact here tonight, one of the avid reader alum. We agreed to meet at Paddington train station in London, and I couldn't help but feel like that lost literary bear with his battered hat in hand, but I needn't have worried. Within minutes of meeting, Yaz and I had begun a conversation that is still underway, years and continents and a pandemic later. It's a conversation that's a pleasure to share with you tonight. Yassmin does not do small talk. She's interested in big questions, big ideas, big hopeful possibilities. And it's this kind of big talking and big thinking that's gotten her into big trouble. In her new book, Talking About a Revolution, Yassmin invites us to think big alongside her, to interrogate the things we value, the faiths we hold, the ways we work, the past we honour, and the future we hope to build. It's a collection of essays that's as eclectic and multitudinous as its author. In these pages, Wittgenstein rubs shoulders with James Baldwin. A disquisition on the social justice tenets of Islam sits next to a passionate love letter to the combustion engine. Yaz knits beanies and trades crypto. She takes on the hypermasculinity of oil rigs, the slipperiness of citizenship, Boris Johnson, French headscarf laws, and Lionel Shriver's limp sombrero. It isn't the tell-all that News Corps might have hoped for, but Yassmin doesn't want to rehash that grisly, devastating story, and nor should she have to. Talking About a Revolution is deeply generous, a collection that shows the evolution of a singular and ever-curious mind. Tonight, I'll be talking to Yaz about the challenges and achievement of writing her own book, her own way. And so it is my deep pleasure to introduce my brilliant friend, Yassmin Abdel-Magied.
Thank you so much for having me, Beejay, and thank you for such a generous intro. It's so nice to be here.
I thought we would pick up basically where we left off in our conversation, let everyone be part of it, because we both work as cultural critics, and something we speak a lot about is the importance of taking the work on its own terms. You've just finished a review of Thomas Piketty's new work for Australian Book Review. I'm working on a piece on Aussie Noir, and I wanted to ask you, what are the terms of this book? How would we take you on your own terms here? Why this book? Why this form? Why this way?
It's such a good question. And it actually makes me think about, it sort of takes me back to why I wanted to put this collection together in the first place. And I think I've always wanted to write an essay collection. I think there's something about the essay form that really speaks to me, the kind of, because quite often it's like, you sort of take a personal experience or like the slip of an idea and you can expand it out, and brilliant authors over, centuries have expanded it out into something. It's not quite, a nonfiction book where you have to sit for days and days on end, but it's something that you can read in perhaps one sitting that plants a seed of thought that then can kind of take you on your own sort of journey. And so for me, essays have changed, like the kinds of the James Baldwins and the Angela Davis and the Audre Lordes and, various, and the Roxane Gays. Like I've read various essayists more recently, actually, Joan Didion and so on. My life has been really impacted by the kinds of ideas I have found in essays. And so I wanted to put a collection of my own essays together, I think partly because I wanted this book to be, one of the bricks in the body of work that I sort of hopefully create over a lifetime. I wanted it to be a coda for my 20s, so a piece of work that speaks to my own evolution over my 20s, my sort of political evolution, my career evolution, the kind of experiences that I've had over, and that's kind of why I wanted to put all these pieces next to each other, because I think they speak to each other in a way that if you read something sort of on its own, you might see it in a particular context, but seeing these pieces sort of next to each other and how they speak to each other was something I thought could be really interesting. And frankly, not only did I want it to be part of, sharing my own personal evolution over time, but I really felt ready to kind of share what I thought about the world in this particular point in time. And that's kind of what this collection is for me. It's, I titled it Talking About a Revolution because I think we are, and I say this at the beginning of the book, like we're in this great moment of transition, and we have been for a little while now, but I think it's clearer than ever that we are in this moment of transition. And thus, we need action. I feel like people understand there's this great desire for change. And the question then becomes, for me, was like, okay, action is vital, but before the action, what is the world that we want to build? How will we survive victory? What does victory even look like? And I'm a big believer in fleshing all of these things out and really getting into the nitty-gritty of these ideas before we start sort of saying, okay, let's go out there and make that change. So I think I wanted to talk about revolution so that I could get us all on the same page, or at least ask questions that make us really think about what it is we're actually fighting for and how do we want to build the world, rather than kind of having in some sense, not necessarily superficial conversations, but I think conversations that take for granted the underlying, the sort of the game, like the rules of the game are already decided for us, right? And I'm kind of saying, can we change those rules? Can we actually tackle those foundational myths that we have accepted for the last 4 or 5 decades. And so that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to strip back some of those underlying myths. I'm trying to get us to kind of get to some of those root assumptions and challenges. And hopefully, really, for me, the success of the book is if people read these essays and then go out and talk to people about them, if it challenges the way they think about something, if it makes them, reflect on their own position on something that they previously thought that they were pretty sure about. This is, I want people to talk about revolution.
I think it's wonderful you talk about evolution of your thinking, because writing is very much a process. It's not a product. And your collection really actively sets out to capture that. You're not building an argument as much as demonstrating how thinking evolves. And one of the ways you've done that is by keeping in your very earliest public writing, some of the stuff you've written, sort of 5, 6, 7 years ago. And I wanted you to talk through that decision, because you haven't re-edited it. You haven't gone back and written codas to it. You've shown it to us in its perhaps naive form, which is a really quite a brave decision, because you could go back now and strip it out and make it perfect, but you haven't. Why not?
I think, yeah, it was a decision that, we had this conversation with the publishers and so on, like, how much did I want to contextualize and rewrite and rework these essays? And there was a part of, there is some cringe almost when you go back to a piece that you've written 5 or 8 years ago, and you're like, oh, that wouldn't be the piece that I write today. But, I guess, I'm somebody that wrote a memoir at the age of 24. It's a ridiculously young age to write a memoir, but I often think of it as like, and we spoke about it at the time actually, as like a snapshot in time. And I think what's really powerful for me about being lucky enough to have published works from the age of 22 is that I capture these snapshots in time of what I've thought about, or like how I thought about the world at that particular point in time. And I felt like it's important for me to be honest about that. Like, I didn't come out of the womb, with my politics fully evolved. As much as I was someone that understood, or had some understanding of the political world and imperialism and all these big ideas, I was still somebody that had inherited a lot of my politics from my parents or from those around me, or from, I grew up in Queensland, Brisbane in the 90s and early thousands. My politics at the time reflect that world. And I guess why I think it's so important for me to be honest about that is because I hope it's reassuring for other people who they themselves might be going through a process of, discovering their own politics or evolving into their own sense of self or their own values. And I also, I think there is an element of like, dampening my own ego, I guess. Like, I can be like, oh yeah, look at how good my most recent essays are or whatever. It's like, remember where you came from. And it's okay. And it's important for everyone to remember where I came from, because it's also like, I didn't start out as like a writer. I remember so distinctly when I first started writing, this woman who, and this isn't the nicest story about them, but she read my work and she was like, it's really, really nice, but you can tell you're not a writer. And I remember being like, oh, but like putting aside, comments that people make that sit with you forever. Not that I'm saying that, I think about this on a daily basis, but what I think is interesting about that is that like some of these earlier essays, I didn't think of myself as a writer. I thought of myself mostly as like a communicator of an experience. And part of the evolution as well is the evolution of me stepping into this identity of being a writer, someone who's interested in the craft of writing and what writing can kind of help, bring out in thinking and so on. So I guess not only is it a political evolution, but hopefully it's a craft one as well.
And I think that's really lovely that you talk about becoming, and you give people the space to not to give their younger selves, treat their younger selves with kindness and a kind of political forgiveness, to understand that you can come to ideas, you can move to them. And when you first think about the young woman who started putting pen to paper, and then the writer you are now, and you are very much a writer, what kind of self, what kind of self have you written into being, do you think? What kind of thinker and writer are you now?
I hope that I am somebody who comes to to the work with like deep consideration and compassion. I think I care a lot about, you know, and I explicitly talk about the sort of values that I state that I care about. You know, I care a lot about grace and kindness and justice. I care about building a world that operates on values that that are not the ones that we have today, that are values around compassion, that are not carceral and so on. So I think, you know, I want to come to my work and to my thinking from a place of what does it look like for us to radically reimagine the world that we are in, and to build a world that is kind of, and that sometimes requires, you know, requires challenging conversations about what we, again, I bring up the word ego, like how do we deal with, you know, the desire to punish, or how do we deal with the desire for revenge or for, you know, for retribution? Like there's the space for anger and the space for these sort of perhaps uglier emotions. And I want to make space for all of that really in my writing. I think what I try to do is to be quite honest about all the different, you know, the pretty and the unpretty in the sort of human experience. I guess the other thing I think is important for me when I write, especially in the nonfiction space, is I want to bring along people with me, right? I want to be accessible, but not with sort of not sort of simplifying ideas beyond like and thus taking out all the nuance. I want us to be able to have these really rich conversations with everybody. Like you know, for me, I think about growing up, and when we would go back to Sudan, for example, or even in the Sudanese community context, you'd have intergenerational groups of people, grandpas, uncles, little babies, all having deep political conversations, and everyone is allowed to be involved in that, and everyone participates. And like, sure, there might be a hierarchy, but the idea of like politics and culture and society being this closed off thing that only a small elite can contribute to, I think that's not the world that I'm interested in. I'm interested in how do we get, I mean, that's why, you know, that's where Youth Without Borders came from. It was about, you know, people want to tell young people what to do, but we have an opinion about how we should do things in our community as well. Let's go out there and do it. So I want my thinking to be something that everyone can access, and that hopefully enriches and helps people consider the perspectives and possibilities they may have not thought of before. That's the ambition.
And anyway. It is, and I think that's the word that came to mind when I was reading it, was not just that it's generous, but it trusts us. It trusts us with big ideas. It trusts us to understand that you're going to put Wittgenstein next to a discussion of how we feel in the world, and those two things are accessible. And I think that really matters, that we invite people into a cultural conversation. We don't speak down to them. If there's an essay in your collection that really speaks to that idea, if there's one essay you could say, I'm particularly proud of this one, which one would it be?
I think like, I think there are a few different essays. And before I answer that, I wanted to add one more thing actually, which is like a reminder perhaps that like, I have never gone to university to study any of this stuff, right? Like I studied mechanical engineering, and part of my desire to make things accessible in this way, and also part of the way that I think about things, I think is informed by the fact that I have in effect taught myself, right? Like I have picked up different readings over the years. And I would say, like, for example, the first essay, Words Mean Things, is a wonderful example for me of how I like to do this, right? Which is, to your point, talk about Wittgenstein at the same time as, you know, the Black British theorist Stuart Hall, at the same time as Colin Kaepernick, at the same time as, you know, my family moving to Australia from Sudan, and like bringing them all together in hopefully a cohesive story. So Words Mean Things is about the way that we use language and so on, and how that impacts our society, but also how that plays out in our individual lives. The other essay that's a little bit different from it, and I'm not sure if other people love as much as I do, but I have a real soft spot for is the empowerment versus power essay, which is this essay that talks about social justice kind of movements and organizing, and kind of puts it alongside, engineering ideas around thermodynamics. And I essentially compare like social justice movements to hurricanes. And I use this idea called complexity theory, which is just like a fancy way of talking about how like something like a hurricane works, right? So what I loved about that was I was like, oh, let me bring the different ways that my brain works together, and hopefully, it's illuminating in some way for people, or at least I can give it to all my engineering friends, and they can, and they can understand maybe in their own language what I'm trying to talk about.
There's a real power in sort of staking your intellectual claim in the way you have, making it solid and tactile and irrefutable, like making it a book, right? In a world of hot takes and kind of reactive outrage, what is the cultural power in putting it down between pieces of paper in a cover and saying, this is a collection, this is a thing?
It's a really good question, isn't it? Because, arguably, more people might read something if it's, more people might immediately read something if it's online, than perhaps might immediately go out to purchase a book. So like, I understand the sort of barrier to entry when it comes to sort of putting a collection like this together. That being said, I still really believe in the power of like literature, as it were. And also, again, I use the phrase like the body of work. Like for me, the cultural power of this was hopefully for it to be part of and to speak to, the tradition that it sits within of people thinking about the world, people using the form of the essay to reflect on the contemporary challenges that we're facing. Like, it'll live in libraries, hopefully. It'll live in bookshops. It'll be something that people can pick up 5, 10, hopefully 30 years down the line and be like, oh, in 2021, this was the book that Yassmin put together. And, and she was somebody who thought about things from, the Black feminist tradition and the Islamic liberationary theology tradition and, all these other, and she was an engineer, and this is how she thought about things. And maybe in another decade, I'll write another collection like this, and they'll be like, oh, and because of the events of the 20s, this is how things changed, and this was, when she started producing work in, God, like 2031 or whatever. Like you can sort of compare those works. I think there is something delightful in being able to make it, less ephemeral, and have some posterity.
I love the way you talk about the kind of collision of ideas, the way you're getting theorists colliding with things that are happening now, colliding with family memoir. And one of the things we've talked a lot is a kind of sense of uprootedness and placelessness. And you grapple with that directly in your essays. But I also wonder how much that sense of being a perennially uprooted person shapes your thinking and allows you to kind of draw connections between things. What do you think you might see in the world that other people don't because you're not rooted in place?
It's something I've been thinking a lot about recently, actually, especially because, I'm interested in social change in this book, but also in life generally. And quite often social change has necessarily been rooted in place, right? Like even when I think about my work with Youth Without Borders, it was very grounded in, in Brisbane, in the place that I grew up in the community that I was part of. And when I look at the various civil rights activists and other activists that I admire, they are rooted in place. And so the question of what does it look like to be engaged in social justice movements when you're floating, when you're in the diaspora, I think has been a challenge that I think that I'm still working through. I think the placelessness allows me to perhaps see connections between different places that perhaps others might not have the opportunity to, simply because their focus is on where they are. And I have been able to sort of compare what's going on, say, in Australia with the United States, with the United Kingdom, with maybe something in Sudan, with maybe something in France, right? So like, it allows me to draw those connections and to also perhaps create, the early or continue the sort of the international solidarity that so many movements historically have drawn power from. And I think maybe it allows me to critique and engage with ideas, not from a place of feeling an allegiance necessarily, but from to a place, but feeling an allegiance to a value or a principle or a way that I think things should be. I don't necessarily feel like I owe any place anything. And that freedom is very powerful, really, in being able to perhaps see things for what they are and not what they say they want to be.
And I think what you do in this essay collection is bring a kind of razor sharp sense of clarity to those ideas. It's not just that you're thinking about how they might collide, but you're interrogating how they sit together. And you do these, you talk about the essay between empowerment and empowerment. That's one of the great examples. Or you talk about the difference between nostalgia and solastalgia, or the distinction between Islam as a political identity and then Islam as a daily practice. And I don't think it's an accident that the first essay in your collection is called Words Mean Things, because you spend a lot of time thinking about those granular distinctions. And when our problem seems so big, so soul-crushingly vast, why do these granular distinctions matter so much?
As you were asking that question, Beejay, I thought what I'm going to do is, pull out my science card really briefly, which is to say, we can have all the conversations we want about matter in the world and, what this house looks like or whatever, but we also know that that at the end of the day, everything's made out of atoms, and those atoms are made up of particular elements and so on. And there is such value in understanding the atomic structure of things, because understanding the atomic structure of things allows us to make sense of what happens when you kind of all put it together. And I guess for me, language and the granularity of these ideas is about understanding the atomic structure of our societies, right? Because I think we understand each other through language. We understand each other through, the small kind of moments where we treat each other in, or we make choices about how we treat each other. And I think, I sort of say that first, and to be honest, I am torn on this, because sometimes I'm like, it doesn't matter, it's all semantics. And then sometimes I'm like, no, but it really does. And again, this is a personal tension for me. I think that sometimes I do wonder, am I spending too much time thinking about the way that we use words? But then I think about the sort of, let me say this. I think one of the things I reference in the essay Words Mean Things is this quote by Walter Benjamin, who's this sort of critic and theorist and fantastic German writer from back in the day. And he talks about how fascistic governments use, they keep people focused on the aesthetics of social change to keep them distracted from the actual work of material reform, right? How and I think that sometimes, the sort of the debates that we have about language can sit in that, the debates that we have about symbols and language can sit in that aesthetic space only. I think we do run a risk when we kind of allow it just to stay in that superficial level. But I'm actually asking us to go deeper, not only to say what, how are we using language, but why are we, when I say I want a world governed by justice, what does that actually mean? It's not about saying this is a word we should use or shouldn't use. It's about saying, what does it mean to have a world, to have a justice system, for example? Does it actually mean punishment? Does it actually mean that, does that mean somebody taking accountability? What does that look like? So I guess really it's a bit of a Trojan horse, because it might seem like a small thing, but hopefully it unfolds for us, the deeper conversation that we need to be having, so that that sort of atomic foundational structure is as robust as it needs to be.
You've just done something in giving that quite extraordinary answer that you do in this essay collection, which I really love, which is at the end of one of your essays particularly, you stop and then you go, I don't think I quite like that conclusion. And then you say, but why don't I like that conclusion? And then you say, actually, that conclusion's fine. And I love that you include that thinking at the end of an essay. And I wonder if you could tell us, in a world that seems to demand the kind of certainty of thought, certainty of expression, the kind of policing of language that you're talking about, what is the value of kind of public doubt, of you as a very public person saying, I don't know if I've got that right?
I mean, I think it's so funny that that we live in a world that demands certainty, when like anyone that's genuinely honest about life can, I think, be honest about the fact that there is so much uncertainty. Anybody I often think about, like, growing up in sort of like organizing spaces and community grassroots spaces, and everything was always up for debate. The idea that we had a small Sudanese community, and the idea that we would all agree on anything is outrageous, right? So I think for me, the idea of like public discussion, or the idea of allowing ourselves to again, I've used this word a number of times today, but like, to be honest about what's really going on. I think, frankly, well, I suppose it's like part of the way that I have tried to lead in my life, whether it's with Youth Without Borders or other kind of contexts, is to have trust in the people around me, to say, hey, I don't know if I actually know the answer, but the value in that is you then allow the group to come up with a better answer, or like stopping and saying, I'm not sure I'm committed to this anymore, gives you the freedom to sort of take a step back and to reevaluate, and to hopefully get to a better outcome. I think, there's the idea of the sunk cost fallacy, because you've committed so much already, you're like, well, I might as well see it through. But actually, that's not a bias that works necessarily always in our favor. Sometimes you get to a point where you're like, I don't know if this is the right choice for me, but am I going to let my ego and this, the amount of time I've put into this train of thought or conversation or whatever, am I going to let that govern the outcome? No, like I can do better than that. And again, it feels sometimes like folly to have to expose myself in this way, because it is a vulnerable thing. Like, in this world, you're expected to have, like fortified walls around you, impenetrable. And in some ways, I have these these fortified walls around me, but at some level, they're also quite permeable, because how else am I going to grow?
I think that's wonderful. And one of the things I love about this book is that you show yourself often as being incredibly fallible. Like, there's an essay about trading cryptocurrency that feels awfully relevant right now and makes you look quite prescient, but it also makes you look like a bit of a sucker. And I think that's kind of wonderful that you show us as you as fallible, not just you as growing, but someone who's capable of making mistakes and thinking about what those mistakes mean for you. But there's a passage in the book, and no matter how many times I read it, it never ceases to sort of stop the breath in my throat. And if there was ever proof needed that you are a writer, it is this. And you write, I could no longer accept the conditional equality that I had been socialized to be grateful for. I would accept nothing less than substantive, transformative, and unconditional equality for myself and others. Now, that's a pretty magnificent, soul-shaking rally cry. How has that reckoning manifested in the way that you're going about your life now? And how do you hope that your readers will act on it?
Yeah, it's sometimes funny hearing your words read back to you, because you're like, oh, nice work, past Yassmin.
Yeah, you did a pretty good job of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think what my experiences have given me and the or led me to, and that kind of realization that's encapsulated in those lines, it has meant that I have, I guess, alhamdulillah, a sense of worth and almost an entitlement to the space that I take up in my life and in the spaces that I'm in. Not necessarily about taking up space in a sort of obnoxious, egotistical manner, but a sort of an assurance of my value and my worth as a human, that I think gives me a strength that is unshakable and actually untouchable by the broader forces that usually would be able to knock one off that path, right? I think when you have a sense of perhaps, we were talking about doubt, uncertainty, and whatever, I think one of the things I am certain about is my right to contribute, my right to my work and my opinions and so on. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I think I am right necessarily, but it certainly means that I feel like I'm just as entitled as anybody else with, I'm living in London. The kinds of people that I engage with, when I'm trying to do literature or art or anything like that, are all these fancy people that have gone to Oxford and done this, that, and the other, and, and have been to schools that are older than most of the countries this country has colonized in a modern kind of nation state sense. And so you're dealing with people that come with all of this kind of weight, right? All of this institutional weight and so on, and they feel so entitled. And I think it can be easy to be intimidated by that. It can be easy to think, oh, maybe I am not as worthy, or maybe I still have to do something to be on their level or whatever. And I think actually, when you really come down to it, why does that institutional sort of legitimacy mean that person is any more worthy than anybody else to contribute to the idea of the world that we want to build, to contribute to the kind of conversations I'm interested in having? And that is quite, I think, a threatening power. It's a power that I revel in, but it's one that I feel very, very grateful to have come to.
You have this magnificent look of joy on your face when you talk about it too. Is that the kind of hope that you have that your readers will act on in the book? Is that what you'd like them to take from it? A sense of space making, whether it's holding a space for others or feeling that they can take space for themselves?
100%. I think, I often want to reinforce to people, I don't think I'm necessarily any more special than anyone else. I think what I want to do is to, spread my arms and, create the space, and hopefully others can, step into that and do the same for themselves and for others. That's, I guess, in a way, I want the work to be democratic, and I want what I do to allow, to be empowering, to, it's in the essay Empowerment versus Power, I talk about power with. I want to have power with. I want this book to create power with the people that I'm in solidarity with. And that's quite exciting, right? Because you don't know what the outcome of that's going to be. You put work out into the world and you try to create the space, but you don't know what's going to happen in that space. And that's exciting.
It's very exciting, but you're also equally excited in this book about muscle cars. And perhaps my favorite essay of the bunch is this passionate love letter to the combustion engine, an invention that is ecologically doomed, and you just can't deny your love for it. In an essay collection about social justice and activism and power and space making and other very serious things, why do we get, and in fact, why do we need a moment of unadulterated fangirling?
There's a fangirl in us all, isn't there, BJ? For whatever it might be. I think this is part of what makes it's what makes me human. And I think there's a real desire in me to remain human for people, and to express or to share my the parts of the contradictions that don't quite make sense. I think people have always thought, it's a bit bizarre that, I have all these progressive aspirations in politics, and yet here I am just like wanting to rev a V12 engine down, hoon it around and through the neighborhood. And that's doesn't quite work with the image, it's not quite what it's giving. So I think, there's kind of two elements to it. One is that, like, this was one of the pieces that just kind of poured out of me. I knew that I wanted to write a piece about cars and a love letter to cars. And, many of the other essays I worked on for weeks and weeks and read and did all of this extra kind of thinking, whatever. This piece, it just came out like it was meant to be. And so it really comes from this emotional place of being like, God, I love the world of, the petrol car. And I also recognize that, like, I don't think I can do that anymore. Like, I don't know how I can live with that anymore. Like, at some point, the balance shifted between this being something that was okay and this being something that isn't anymore. And the other part, I guess, a more kind of maybe political part, is like, I think it's okay for us to grieve the changes that come with accepting climate change as a reality that we have to meet and deal with. And I think, it's maybe if you didn't grow up with a love of, my childhood is very fossil fuel my adolescence is very fossil fuel heavy, right? Like, my first job at 17 was in a coal mine. And then I worked in oil and gas for 4 years before I moved into sort of the space of writing and broadcasting. Like, I spent a lot of time in this world. I wouldn't do it now, but I think it's important to allow me to be honest, to have a relationship with those eras, and to accept and be compassionate about the fact that one goes through a journey of grief and mourning for something that now feels lost. And perhaps this is, a political point. There's just got to be space for that kind of conversation, even if it's not one that we think is like, perhaps if you have if you grew up with a different experience or with a different politic, it seems ludicrous to want to do that. But I felt like it was important to acknowledge that that's a process that does happen.
We have time now for questions, I believe. Jackie, are you there with any questions from our audience?
I am. Hang on a sec. I'll bring my camera back on as well.
I have two more that I want to ask, yes, but I'll leave it to the end.
Okay, no, we've got some good ones. So we'll start with Chrissy, who says, do you think that person who critiqued your writing craft would look at this book and see that you have emerged as a real writer now?
I hope so, Chrissy. I really, really do. I think part of it is I think there's lots of people who write, who like have a tortured relationship with the idea, the identity of being a writer. But I think, I did the Emerging Writers Festival recently, and I think one of the things I said to them was like, ultimately, it is also an identity that you can maybe choose to step in. And I think more recently, I have chosen to step into that identity, unself-consciously. And so even if somebody said that now today, I think I would have a very, I'm less looking for validation, even though, writers love validation. I'm less looking for that and more being able to give it to myself, inshallah.
Now, she's been greedy and asked a second question as well, which is, could you ask her about her work for younger readers? Is that work just as important as serious essays?
So yes, I actually, I love writing for younger readers. And I think that, the Layla book, So You Must Be Layla and Listen Layla, in a way, tackle so many of the same kinds of questions that I talk about in my adult essays, but just through through a 13 or 14-year-old character. I don't necessarily actually think the ideas are any less complex, right? Like Layla deals with questions of forgiveness and justice and punishment and how to deal with revolution and her place in the world and all these sorts of things. And I have always believed that it's really important to speak to that sort of group of children, not as adults, but in a serious manner, because I think young people do engage with these questions in a serious manner. The only problem is adults think that they're, better than middle grade fiction books, so they don't pick them up. So I'm like, well, fine, I'll put them in an essay collection for you.
We have a comment from Mona, who I don't think expected it to be read out loud. It was just a private message, but it was so nice, I'm going to read it out loud. This is an absolutely amazing conversation and deeply poignant on a personal level.
Oh,
I have a direct message.
You've got to read the compliments. Oh, you want to go?
I also have a direct message from Nadia, who says, Yassmin, I think you're very brave and honest for expressing self-doubt. How do you ensure other people do not see this as a lack of confidence and talk down to you as a result? For I found when I express uncertainty, even in a self-deprecating way, people read this as a lack of confidence and competence.
Such a good question. And it is one of the things that I think, when I talked about it being exposing, I think this is what I was referring to, is people sort of seeing it as weakness, seeing it as a lack of competence, seeing it as like a lack of conviction, even perhaps. I think that the difference is perhaps in, when I talk about self-doubt, I'm not necessarily doubting, say, my values or my right to be there, perhaps, but I'm sort of allowing the space for questions in an environment around a particular topic, right? And so I, for example, will, even though I might sort of say, okay, maybe this thread of thinking isn't what I'm actually committing to, or maybe, this conclusion isn't the thing that I wanted it to be, but I will never say, but I would never write, maybe I shouldn't be writing this book, right? Because I think that they're actually different kinds of questions. So I think you have to, for me anyway, that sort of certainty of worth and of self-value is one thing, and separate from the kind of the space that allows for a position. I guess it's a doubt about a position, as opposed to like about and how do I control? One thing I have accepted is that I cannot control what people think of me. That is, a ship that has sailed, and one that is, that I cannot change the winds about. So I spend less time thinking about what people think about me, what people generally think about me, and more time about thinking, A, what do I think of myself? B, are the people whose opinions I care about, are they understanding what it is that I'm trying to do, and do they respect, the kind of what it is that I'm trying to do? And I guess C, is this something that I feel like, is this a vulnerability that is too sensitive to be out in the world? Or am I ready for other people to have opinions on it? Because some things I will not put up for public consumption. And other things I feel ready to. So I think it's also about navigating my own sort of relationship to what it is that I'm sort of doubting and putting out into the world. I hope that makes sense.
I can sort of, from an entirely critical point of view, when I read that essay, the fact that you expressed doubt made me feel more confidence about the essay itself, because it had
interesting
space for me to think inside of it, but also the fact that I knew that you were interrogating it and thinking about it made it feel like a living thing. And that creates this real trust that I'm in the hands of a person who is thinking, who isn't parroting an idea or putting down an argument they haven't interrogated, but that I'm in the hands of an interrogative, curious mind. That's what I loved about it. And that's what I think comes really strongly across when you do it the way you do.
Thanks, Beejay.
Do we have more questions, Jackie?
Yeah, we've got a few and they're still coming in. So we might have to have a quick fire round. But,
sorry.
We have from Celia, Yassmin, I read James Baldwin in the 70s in my teens and love his work still. Do you hope that by including such a range of other thinkers in your work, you make it easier for older readers to join you in discussion and on your journey?
I really hope so. I think that for me is part of the ambition, really. Like I referenced, the Baldwins, people like Stuart Hall, who, folks from the 70s and 80s and 90s in the UK, for example, or, in the cultural theorist space would be familiar with, but other people might not. The fact that I bring that in will hopefully speak to a particular audience. I mean, I keep talking about being part of the tradition, but I want to continue to build on work that's already out there. And hopefully, maybe one day people will build on mine. Like that's the dream.
And we've got one of your favorite questions, but it begins with a compliment from Robin. I can't tell how wonderful it is to see and hear you speaking tonight. I miss your face on Australian media. Is there a chance we might see you in the flesh anytime soon?
Look, I don't know. I mean, my parents are begging me. My dad is always like, look how sunny it is here. Because it is always, even today, even though it's the middle of summer, gray outside. But I think, yes, I think that the jury is out for when I'll next be in town. But I'll tell you what, I'll definitely make it through Avid. The next time I come to Australia, Avid is always getting a visit.
Okay, I'm going to start reading fast because questions are still pouring in. So, Talking About a Revolution is an iconic Tracy Chapman song. Is this where the title comes from? It's a slow, sad song imagining a turning point. Have you found a personal turning point in the writing of this collection?
Yes, it's definitely from the Tracy Chapman song. I actually grew up on that song. I paint this picture at the beginning of the introduction about, me. There's a video of me as like a little fat, baby sort of waddling around, listening to Talking About a Revolution. So that Tracy Chapman song and album has been part of my life since I was a child. And I think, it is also a song that has always planted in me the idea of like revolution belonging to everybody, because she talks about the people standing in welfare lines and the people, and in another song, Across the Lines, she's talking about different communities, and I always, it didn't feel like the revolution she was talking about was something for the elites or just something just for the sort of the educated writing books. It was for everybody, and I think that's kind of part of where the desire to include this came from.
From Mona, as a Papua New Guinean, I just need to say I haven't forgotten manners and I will never forget for the Australian government for that. Having said that, what are your thoughts around citizenship? You touched on it briefly, but what does citizenship/nationhood mean for you? And do you feel patriotic to any one country/nation?
So it's a great question. And I think that the jury for me is still out on how I feel about citizenship, and how I feel about the idea of the nation state generally. And so in one of the essays called Whose Borders Are They Anyway, I sort of interrogate my own relationship with the idea of citizenship, interrogate quite frankly, a lot of violence that is enacted in the name of borders and nation states and citizenship and so on. And I think this is probably something, to be honest, that I will continue to write on. And I mean, I don't personally feel, I talk about wanting to unbelong. I don't personally feel that the passport and the paper that the citizenship, is on, I don't think it makes me, I don't think it necessitates that I feel patriotic. I don't think it means that I owe the state anything, frankly. But I think I need to interrogate this more, right? Because it's a rich seam of, lots of people have written about citizenship over the years. It's and then it's about the building block of how we put the world together. So it's definitely something that I am interested in writing more about and would love to hear people's thoughts on.
There are so many more questions coming in. Okay, let's see. Salam Yassmin.
You want to ask a couple at the same time? Sorry, maybe so, because I can go for ages. So maybe ask a few at the same time and I'll see if I can.
Oh, okay, let's see. I'd like to hear Yassmin's thoughts on whether she deems cryptocurrency to be halal or haram, as there seems to be differences of opinions within Sharia law on this type of finance.
I am not a scholar, would not be able to tell you the first thing about whether something is halal or haram. I would say that it is definitely, it's got a lot of hallmarks of gambling. So I don't know if I would, if I would necessarily say it's the safest investment. It's much more a speculative asset that that frankly makes money from, is a financialized thing that is not necessarily rooted in any actual value creation. So make of that what you will.
You talk about mourning. Any tips for how we manage our grief and anger so it doesn't disrupt everything?
I think we need spaces and rituals for our grief and our anger and our mourning. I think like a lot of societies throughout history, especially, First Nation societies and societies that kind of have a collectivist value set, they tend to be ones that have set rituals for things like grief and mourning and so on. And so I think we need to think of, as a society, and the various societies we're part of, what does it look like for us to have rituals around this stuff, and space for us to do, to kind of collectively, we have not mourned collectively the fact that we have lived through 2 years plus of a pandemic. How do we collectively mourn something as significant as that? I don't think we have the answer, but I think it's vital if we are able to sort of heal and move forward.
This is amazing, by the way, this quick fire round. You should be getting double points for these answers and doing it so quickly. I've got 2 left and I'm going to hand back over to Beejay. So how did your writing change, if at all, when you stepped into the identity of a writer?
Tell you what, I definitely started observing the world a little more. Like, I definitely feel that, like, when you sort of, you're like, oh, the colors in the tree, or like isn't that, little quirk that person does quite interesting? Maybe I'll borrow that and use it for a character one day. So I definitely think it's kind of changed my attitude about, the way that I move through the world. And I also think it gave me permission to spend more time thinking. And that is like such a luxury, like thinking about ideas and discussing them and reveling in them. And like, it's just been, I recognize that that's part of the work. And to be able to not feel guilty about that has been fantastic.
Finally, from me, who are some writers you admire or who shaped your mind?
So a few that I've mentioned already: James Baldwin, Roxane Gay, Angela Davis. I think more recently, Michelle de Kretser, actually, from a fiction point of view, is someone that I really admire, and have kind of been astounded at how, the way that she is able to so deftly, touch on political, like the politics of the world in fiction form, is something that I like admire a lot. And I would probably include Zadie Smith. I've recently read some of her work, and I just think, even though we are very different temperaments, I think in terms of our writing, I just, the line, the words on the line are just, I'm like, oh, I'm gonna sit with that for some time now. So yeah. And Beejay, of course, yes.
No. We're going to get some sort of championship trophy engraved for you for that. Beejay, back to you.
I'll just ask one last question, Yaz, and it's from a quote you have in your book, and you say, what does it mean when we carve noble sentiments from the lumber of our trauma? How do I avoid the danger of a single story, even one written by me? And I think that's an extraordinary question. I thought I'd leave by saying, do you have a sense of an answer to it? And what are the stories you tell about yourself now?
I think it's very natural for us to want to tell ourselves stories about ourselves that make us feel better about the things that have happened, to carve noble sentiments, as it were. I think the way that I have dealt with the fear I have about trapping myself in a single story is by consistently trying to come up with new stories of who I am, you know, and to feel okay, to give myself permission to let previous versions of myself, to leave previous versions of myself behind. I've spent a long time like questioning or feeling bad about the fact that I no longer work as an engineer. I think that is, you know, there were, for a long time, my single story was like, I'm an engineer and I do these other things, but really I'm an engineer. And that in itself was something that was quite, you know, limiting in a particular way, even though I found it quite powerful. And being able to say, you know, today, oh, actually, I'm a writer. And that's something that I've stepped into and I've made a conscious choice about. And maybe in 10 years, it'll be something else, and maybe it won't be. But giving ourselves the permission to tell different stories about ourselves, even just, you know, when you're introducing yourself to somebody new, testing out a different story about yourself, or testing out, you know, like a literal different description of the kind of work you do or the way that you spend your time. I think somebody said to me recently, like, you know, you should always be thinking about, this is a bit of a weird thing to say, but always be thinking about rewriting your bio, because like, you know, and bringing something new into it, because that sort of can help you reshape your, even, you know, the one-liner that you are. And there is just something about actively choosing to rewrite ourselves as often as possible, just to keep us on our toes a little bit. Perhaps that maybe in a year I'll have a different answer, Beejay, but that's how I'm feeling about it today.
Well, that if you have a different answer a year from now, you will have proved your answer today completely right. I think if there's a watchword to our conversation today, it's permission. Permission to take up space, permission to change, permission to hope, permission to doubt, permission to tell different stories about ourselves. And so I'd like everyone to think about what that would mean for themselves. And I give you permission now to thank the wonderful, the brilliant Yassmin Abdel-Magied, which I fucked up really badly.
Thank you so much, Beejay. Thanks, Jackie and Avid as well for having me. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you everyone for joining us. And I hope, you know, if you do get a chance to read the book, I hope you enjoy it. And please do let me know your thoughts as you travel through it. But thank you.
Well, to add my thank you to that, thank you for incredible questions, Beejay. They're so insightful. And thank you, Yassmin, for your record-breaking and incredible, thoughtful answers. It's been a real privilege to be here, sitting and observing it. So thank you all.
Thank you. Everyone. Enjoy your evening, everyone. Bye.